anyone to be sent, for a scheme, by the way, that the Home Office officials have described as unenforceable and at high risk of fraud. Hundreds of millions of pounds could now be 400 million pounds. And I would like the Immigration Minister, whichever of the Immigration Ministers is winding up today, to explain whether in fact this is now a 400 million pound plan. Hundreds of millions of pounds that could be spent on thousands more police to boost our border security and to smash the criminal gangs. Hundreds of millions of pounds that could have been used to clear the backlog entirely, end hotel use and save us a further couple of billion pounds, or could have trained 1,000 doctors or 4,500 nurses. And of course, they'll have to spend further money if they manage to send people there, probably around £200,000 per person. Perhaps they can confirm that figure, more than twice as much as it costs here in the UK. So can they confirm this scheme in total is going to look like it's going to be closer to £500 million for Rwanda by the time they finished, just for a few hundred people, just for around 1% of those arriving in the country? Because the Court of Appeal have said there's only capacity in Rwanda for around 100 people. Even the judge who agreed with the government said talk of thousands is political hyperbole. The asylum system in Rwanda, we know, is also limited. They've only processed an average of 100 people a year for the last 3 years. So at most, a few hundred people. 56,000 people are in hotels. 100,000 applied for asylum last year. 160,000 people waiting in the backlog. Potentially, this is less than 0.1% of those who will be covered. It is no wonder that the Permanent Secretary said yesterday, we have no evidence of a deterrent effect. So now they're on their third new law in 2 years. Home Secretary said the bill means if you enter Britain illegally, you'll be detained and swiftly removed to a safe country such as Rwanda, except that that wasn't him, that was his predecessor, talking about the last bill, the Illegal Migration Act, passed 4 months ago, the main section of which hasn't actually been enacted because they know it won't work. Home Secretary has also said the bill will deter illegal entry into the UK. Anyone who arrives illegally will be sent to the country they've arrived from or a safe third country. But that also wasn't this Home Secretary or this bill. That was his predecessor, but for when she introduced the main provisions of the Nationalities and Borders Act, which was passed 18 months ago. And the main section of that one has been revoked because it made things worse. So the first one largely revoked because it made things worse. The second one not yet enforced because they know it won't work. So forgive us for not believing a single word about the bill that is being brought forward today, because we've heard it all before. And the Immigration Minister should respond about what is going to happen about Clause 2 of the Illegal Migration Act, which requires the Home Secretary to remove everyone to Rwanda or elsewhere if they arrived after July. They've put it on hold, apparently until Rwanda gets off the ground. But even if they do manage to do that quickly, more than 15,000 people will have arrived in the country on small boats since then, all of whom they've now promised to send to Rwanda. So if Rwanda's only going to take a few hundred people a year, it's going to take them over 100 years to send the 15,000 people who have arrived since they passed the last law. It'll take them 10 years to send everyone who's arrived in the last fortnight alone. And in the meantime, while they focus on this gimmick, they're failing to get a grip and they're failing to bring down the backlog. And instead, we've got people in asylum hotels at taxpayers' expense at the astronomical cost of £8 million a day. I will give way to a member.
I've listened with interest for almost 15 minutes to hear what her solution to this incredibly difficult problem is. She refers to the fact rightly that we have asylum seekers in hotels at considerable cost and at considerable difficulty when it comes to the disbursement to our local authorities and to all of us as constituency MPs. But I do not hear a single word of recognising that what the government is coming up with is a solution which may not work completely, but which may have a deterrent effect and which may be a welcome step in a series of steps to help reduce illegal immigrants into our country. Does she not recognise that?
Well, £400 million for a failing plan is a hell of a lot of money. What we need to do is clear the backlog, and Labour has set out a proposal for 1,000 new caseworkers to clear the backlog, a new returns unit to make sure instead of this 50% collapse in returns, we actually return people who have no right to be here. Do that, clear the asylum and end the asylum hotels, and that will save the taxpayer £2 billion. Instead of throwing hundreds of millions of pounds, this will save the taxpayer billions of pounds. I'll give way to the honourable member, former colleague on the Home Affairs Select Committee on the back row.
To the right honourable lady in giving way, and absolutely we work together on the Home Affairs Select Committee. I'm a Kent Member of Parliament, and we need to make sure we take firm, decisive action to deal with illegal migration. I'm open-minded to looking at this bill to see if it delivers that. But does she agree with me when I try to intervene on the Home Secretary? The point is this: the number of people in the UK who've lost their asylum claims, but yet they are still in the UK. What are we going to do, and what is the government plan to ensure that those people are removed? Because that is a deterrent. And I haven't been given the numbers of how many of those who've lost all their claims have been removed in the last year, for the last 2 years, or the last 3 years. Because if we want deterrent, we need to look at that as well as this.
Vet Cooper.
So I totally agree with the honourable member. And that is why I hope there should be cross-party support for a plan to have a major new returns unit to actually turn that round. You've got 40,000 people who are here, who've had their claim rejected, who should be being returned, and they're not being. A 50% drop in returns under the Conservatives over 13 years of the Conservatives. Actually, a further 17,000 who've just disappeared into the system altogether, where there should be proper enforcement as well. But the government's not taking action on any of those things. There's no grip in the system. So actually, Labour would do that. We would set up a new major returns unit with 1,000 staff to make sure that we have proper enforcement in place. And the combination of that and the caseworkers will save the taxpayer £2 billion as well. But this treaty and the legislation before us, Mr. Progress first, the treaty and the law before us, we've got the treaty says that numbers are limited by Rwandan capacity. The number of vulnerable refugees sent here, of course, is not limited. The treaty says Rwanda can terminate the deal at any time, doesn't have to take anybody. The treaty also says the UK will fund the support of asylum seekers and people granted refugee status for 5 years. That includes accommodation and 3 meals a day for 5 years. Well, that's more than here in the UK. It says that people can't be sent anywhere else, but can be sent back to the UK, and the Immigration Minister, well, at least one of them, has confirmed that if someone commits a terrible crime in Rwanda, actually, the Rwandan justice system doesn't have to deal with them. They can just send those criminals back to the UK, so you couldn't make it up. You've got trafficking and torture victims, and Afghans who help our armed forces and have fled the Taliban sent to Rwanda, but convicted criminals sent back here. The law before us is a total mess, which is why all sides of the Conservative Party don't like it, even though most of them will still vote for it because they are in such a mess. Some of them want to stop all court challenges. Actually, I think probably some of them want to stop all courts because they've long ripped up being the party of law and order or the rule of law. Some of them want the UK to pull out of the ECHR, no matter the consequences for the Good Friday Agreement, the Windsor Agreement, the prospect of any future security or return agreements with other countries. And then this really astonishing scene of the British Prime Minister claiming that somehow it's the Rwandan government's commitment to the ECHR is the reason why he can't possibly breach it, that they are keeping the British Prime Minister on the straight and narrow, even though it's the Rwandan government who was found by the British Supreme Court to be in breach of international law. So this is kind of through the looking glass now. Does the Rwandan government really suddenly care about the European Convention on Human Rights, or did the Prime Minister ask them to say that they wanted the European Convention on Human Rights to be complied with because he was too weak to tell his backbenchers that actually he thinks our great country should abide by international laws that we helped write and that we currently urge everyone else to follow?